Hello everyone and welcome to my first of two videos on this, the Asahi Pentax SV, also called the H3V. In Japan and some of the other markets it was the SV, in the US it was the H3V imported by Honeywell. They're the exact same camera, so yeah, this just has a different name. The Pentax SV is a 35mm interchangeable lens SLR. What does that mean? You can take any 35mm film, and by any, I mean truly any 35mm film, because this camera has no light meter. As long as you can dial in a shutter speed and aperture that work for the film you're using in the lighting conditions you have, this camera can do it. Interchangeable lens means that the lenses on it can be removed after some unscrewing, and a different lens can be put on at any time when you're not taking a photo, and your film will be unaffected by that. And single lens reflex means that the camera has a single lens on the front of it. The light passes through the lens to a mirror that's behind the lens, up to the prism right here, and out to your viewfinder. And so you see what the camera is going to take a picture of right up until the moment when you take a photo. Like I said, it has no light meter. So if you use this camera and you're not good at gauging exposures in your light settings, you'll want to carry either a spot meter, it's a handheld spot meter, those are the gold standard, but a handheld scene meter, either a vintage one from the 50s, 60s, or 70s will be just fine, or a free downloadable smartphone app with a light meter on it is also a really great option. And you can use any of that for getting meter readings with this camera. So there you go. Shutter speed is 1/1000th of a second on the fast side to 1 second on the slow side, as well as bulb and T. T stands for time, B stands for bulb. So I'm going to show you really quickly the way that bulb and time work, because they're a little bit different. We'll switch here to bulb. Okay, I'm going to hold down the shutter button, and as long as I hold the shutter button down, the shutter's open, and you'll see in a second when I release it that the mirror flips right back into place, okay? Next, I'm going to switch this to T. So now we're on time. I'm going to push the shutter button, and I'm going to let go. The shutter will now stay open as long as that's set to T. Okay, so to get out of T, I just have to switch it to B, and now the shutter closes. All right, so bulb is really good for long exposures if you have like a cable and you want to, say, do a 5-second exposure. You have a cable and you push the plunger, count to 5, and release. That's great. Time is really great if you're going to do something like a star trails photo overnight. You push the time button, you go inside, have a nice cup of hot chocolate, let it sit for a few hours out there, come back right before dawn, and then turn it to bulb, shutter closes, you have your star trails photo. Really low effort. Okay. The viewfinder on this camera, which is on the back here, has magnification of 0.88x and 93% frame coverage asterisk. Both of those are estimates on my part. I couldn't find anywhere where there was documentation to confirm that for this camera model. However, this, as I understand it, the Spotmatic line of cameras used the exact same prism setup as the S line of cameras did, and so those specs come from the Spotmatics, specifically the SL, which is functionally this camera. The SL is a Spotmatic without a light meter. So if those numbers aren't precise, they're pretty darn close. The focusing screen in this camera is fixed, meaning that you cannot take it out and replace it. It has a central microprism. Actually, no, it doesn't. That's incorrect. It is a Fresnel screen with 2 different focusing aids in the middle, but the entire thing is a matte screen. And in the second video, I'll hand draw out what it looks like, and we'll talk about how to use the focusing screen for focusing with this camera. This is, by the way, an amazing camera to use for manual focusing. It's just simply delightful the way that the focusing screen is designed. The flash sync on this camera is a quite weird and unusual 1/50th of a second. And so on the shutter dial, when you get here to the X, that's your flash sync speed. It's between a 60th and a 30th because it is 1/50th of a second. The target market for the SV, also called the H3V, was the advanced user. And the reason for that is because this was like the most advanced of the S bodies. It had a handful of really fancy bells and whistles like automatic aperture control and a self-timer and time mode that some of the other cameras in the lineup lacked. It was made by Asahi Optical Company in Japan from 1962 until 1968. If there's a way to tell for sure exactly when an SV was made, I couldn't find out when it was, but at any rate, I couldn't even find like a serial number guide online or anything like that. If you have your Pentax SV or your Pentax H3V, same camera again, we're going to go over what everything on the camera is. We'll talk about a few minor things here, but in the second video, we'll talk about how to use all of the stuff on this camera for taking photos, okay? Starting on the top as we do, but technically on the front, here are your strap lug split rings and the strap lugs. If you are missing your split rings, just simply grab any split rings and attach them, and that'll be just fine. Here is your self-timer. The way that the self-timer works is that you wind it in the direction of the arrow that's just right here. And then after you've wound it, you just push this button. The self-timer will wind down, trigger the shutter at the end, and you have done a self-timer exposure. Self-timer will work with every shutter speed except B. In fact, I'm pretty sure it will also work with T, which is kind of an unusual thing. Let's double check that my recollection on that is correct. One thing about the self-timer is you don't have to wind it up the whole way. I'm just going to wind it up part way for this. There we go. My recollection was correct. So with time mode and the self-timer, what you can do is you can set the self-timer, have the shutter trigger at the end of that, and go into time mode so that you don't risk accidentally shaking the shutter when you start time mode by pushing down on the shutter release button. So that's a really nice way to use time mode. In addition to the self-timer up here, you also have a film index, okay? So the way that this index works is that you can just kind of push it right here with this little knob, okay, in some direction. And basically, I guess there's kind of an index line right here on the dial, but basically whatever number you're looking at is what you have. This is not going to control anything with your camera. It is literally just a reminder to you of what type of film you have. White numbers for black and white, green numbers for color, and then the number is just your speed. It's marked ASA, but ASA and ISO are the exact same thing. So yeah, this is just a reminder. I honestly don't even use it. I take a piece of masking tape or frog tape, slap it on the back, write what type of film I'm using, and ignore that dial. This is the film rewind dial, and yeah, this is what it does. All it does is rewind the film because the film back release is over here. Serial number, model number, self-timer release button. No hot shoe because this model predates hot shoes or cold shoes. Honestly, that's one of my favorite things about this model is I just love the way that the lines are on this with no hot shoe. This index right here is orange when you're ready to take a photo, black after you've fired the shutter, just like that, okay? Shutter speed dial is up here. This is your shutter speed index. It's very hard to see on this camera, but there's a little line right there that's pointing to B right now, and that tells you what your shutter speed is. This notch in your shutter speed dial was for a clip-on light meter that clipped onto the top of this camera. Film advance lever right here. Frame count window over here. On the front of the camera, we have a handful of things. We have this logo. That's not stock. I took this off of a nasty old leather camera case and glued it on with some plyo bond. So that's my own addition to this camera. Lens mount, Asahi Pentax. These are your flash PC ports. That doesn't stand for personal computer. You can't connect this camera to your computer. That stands for Pronter Compor. And basically those ports, we'll talk about them at length in the second video, connect to a flash PC cable to trigger a flash. For right now, what you need to know is there are two of them, FP and X. Any flash that has a reusable bulb on it is X. FP is for flashes that had single-use bulbs. They're really not made anymore. They're pretty obsolete. If you are using this camera today with a flash connect it to the X sync. Your best bet for this camera is to grab a little plastic hot shoe cover if you can get your hands on one, and just plug it right into the FP socket as a way to remind yourself to never ever use that socket. I thought I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to demonstrate this on the fly. I'll be super smooth. There we go. That was fidgety. Okay. Inside of the lens mount, you can see the mirror, but right now what we're going to talk about is this little flappy paddle right here. When you take a photo, that flappy paddle pops upward and it triggers this pin on the bottom of your lens, okay? And so when you have the lens mounted, the lens will always be open to the aperture will always be open if you're set to auto mode. And then when the flappy paddle triggers that little pin, which is right there, it closes the aperture down for the photo. Okay, that's how that works. In manual mode, which this lens has to be mounted to the camera in order for that to work because it's smarter than I am. In manual mode, the aperture closes the aperture ring closes the aperture down instantly. But for the purposes of this video, the flappy paddle closes the aperture to the selected aperture right before the shutter is fired for the exposure. On this side of the camera, all we have is the film back release right here, which is what we'll use to get inside of the camera in just a moment. There's nothing on the other side of the camera. On the back of the camera, we have tons to see. The viewfinder. That's it. Also made in Japan, but there's nothing else on the back of the camera. On the bottom of the camera, we have two things of note. The film rewind button, which is conveniently marked with the letter R. Honestly, really nice detail that got dropped in all of the cameras after this generation. And the tripod socket, standard 1/4-20 tripod socket. We get inside of the camera by pushing down on this lever release and lifting the camera back door open, okay? Inside is everything that we need to take a photo. So what we have inside of the camera, this is the film cassette chamber right here. And in the second video, I'll show you how to load film, but it just gets plopped right in there. This film rewind knob and these forks plug into the film cassette. Okay, that's important for the second video. These silver rails are the film guide rails. The way that these work is that the film rests right here. The outer guide rails prevent the film from moving up and down, and the inner guide rails sandwich the film up against the film pressure plate, which I'll show you in just a second, so that the film is flat right here in front of the shutter curtain. When the shutter curtain opens and the film is behind it and flat, the light from the lens is properly focused into the film, and you can take a photo on the film. This is your film tension sprocket, and what this does is it prevents the film from moving backwards, because film, when it sits inside of a cassette, has a tendency to build up a bit of a spring memory, and it wants to pull itself back into the cassette. But that sprocket will only move forward, and only when the shutter, or film advance lever rather, is being advanced. So this pulls the film out of the cassette and across the shutter area. In order to make it spin backwards, you have to push the film rewind button and then it will spin freely, which will be important in the second video. So yeah, just remember that for there. This is the film take-up spool. The film is taken up on this spool as it's advanced. On the door of the camera, we have the film pressure plate. This is what sandwiches the film in front of the curtain so that it's flat and light can be properly focused on it. Now here we have this little spring. This spring lines up with the film cassette chamber over here so that the cassette is properly aligned within the camera so that the film can move out of the cassette smoothly and then be rewound back into it smoothly. I do have some tips for you on your Pentax SV, Pentax H3V. The first is that it is ideal for film speeds slower than anything that a camera with a light meter can accept. The slowest light meter I can think of on a camera is with the Canon A1. It goes down to 6 ISO. With this, if you want to shoot some of that 1.5 ISO film that's just a respooled Kodak internegative or interpositive film, I forget which, you can. I've done that with this camera. It's a ton of fun. Sunny 16, of course, f16 full sun, 1.5 ISO, 1.5 second exposure. Very, very slow film, but exceptional detail. So you can do that with that stuff. You can use this for any type of film that you can put in it. Like I said, if you're shooting Delta 3200, inside a studio. As long as you know the proper settings, you can do that. The camera rather, does not care what type of film you put in it. It doesn't have any circuitry. It doesn't have a light meter. So you can put what you want into it and use it. I used to say this was one of my 2 favorite Pentax M42 bodies because it's light, it's simple, it's reliable, it looks really great, especially with all this wear. This is such a gorgeous camera with all the brassing. I would actually revise that now to say this is my favorite M42 body, not just Pentax, my favorite M42 camera, period, end of story. I've used 30 different M42 cameras in my life, if I were to take a guess, and this is the one, the best. I absolutely love this camera. It will be the last M42 camera I sell. It will probably have it for the rest of my life. That's my goal anyway. So it's a super delightful camera to use. The shutter sound is so wonderful. Let me give you guys a good sampling of it. Like, the sound, it's like, it's not obnoxious. It's kind of quiet. It's very light and delicate. There's almost no, when I hold it, I can feel the shutter slapping a little bit in the button here, but really it doesn't have that like violent shutter action that a lot of later cameras have. It's just very delicate and light. It's just so beautifully engineered. Anyway, I'm gonna stop gushing about my SV now and give you some things not to do with this camera. First one is don't store it with the shutter ready to fire. Always fire the shutter before you put it away because this is fully mechanical. When you arm the shutter by advancing the film, you put tension on a bunch of springs inside of it, and if those springs sit with tension on them, they can develop a memory which can cause them to fatigue and break, or just have the timing get thrown off. You don't want that. The next thing is don't actually touch the shutter curtains. This camera has new shutter curtains in it because I'm not supposed to tell you who did them, but I don't think, because I don't think he wants lots of people asking for it. But I was able to get someone to replace the shutter curtains in these with new, because the ones that were in there simply like they were dust and they shattered. And that's a problem with these cameras, is that the old S cameras and H cameras, the curtains in them have started to fail because they the fabric's just old. So, but this one has brand new curtains, which is nice. I can use it for a long time. But don't touch the curtains, because even if you have good curtains that are in good condition, you could theoretically break them because they are. This camera is very old at this point. What did I say? 1960s, 62 to 68. So anyway, this thing is already collecting its 401k and Social Security. The next thing is behind the lens is a mirror. Don't touch it with your fingers because your finger oil can cause that to get desilvered or tarnished rather, one of those two, and that will affect your ability to get accurate focus or to have a bright viewfinder focusing screen. Don't let it get wet. It's not weather sealed. It's metal on the inside. Water and metal in a closed environment, it's gonna rust and it'll just completely brick your camera. Don't store it in your car because it could be a theft target, but even if it's not, the lubricating oils in a hot car in the lens will get very thin and they get to places they shouldn't be. Same thing with the lubricating oils in the camera's body. And then when they get back to their proper viscosity, they impair camera operation. In extreme cold, those lubricating oils get very thick and gummy and they start to break down, and that can also impair camera operation. So definitely just don't leave your camera in your car. Don't store it in a plastic bag or box because plastic is moisture permeable. If you have a rechargeable desiccant pack, you can do that. In fact, I do store my cameras in Pelican boxes with a desiccant pack, but it needs to be a good rechargeable desiccant pack, okay? But don't store it in a plastic bag or box without that because moisture can permeate through that plastic, get into your lenses, and then that can cause fungus to grow in your lenses, or it can get into your camera covering, and that can cause mildew to grow, and that makes using your lenses, it can impair image quality. A mildewy camera, not great when it's up next to your nose. And just remember that your Pentax SV H3V is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So that's it for the first video. Here's a card that will take you to the second video if you'd like to go through the SV with me and learn how to use every single feature and function that it provides. See you there.